Dr. Jay Bhattacharya is one of the co-authors of the Great Barrington Declaration. Now, if you don't know what that was, those were the scientists and doctors who had better ideas on how to treat COVID and that they should have targeted the vaccines at certain people, and they shouldn't have had a lockdown, and they should have just taken care of the people who are actually at risk. That was their idea. And immediately, Dr. Fauci had his minions, his paid tools in the media to write smear pieces about all the people who were signed on to the Great Barrington Declaration because they were getting Nobel Prize winners to join on to the Great Barrington Declaration. And they knew that that would be bad for Dr. Fauci's plan to lock the whole world down. And so anyway, that he was the co-author of the Great Barrington Declaration, and which was a focused approach to COVID that seeks to protect the most vulnerable while avoiding or minimizing the societal harm to COVID-19 lockdowns. He's a professor at Stanford University Medical School, a physician epidemiologist, health economist, and public health policy expert focusing on infectious disease and vulnerable populations. Welcome back to the show, Dr. Bhattacharya.
Thank you for having me on, Jimmy. Really grateful to be on.
It's great to hear your voice again. So the Twitter, this is a great article in the Wall Street Journal. It's an opinion piece about how you were censored and shadow banned on Twitter, right? So we're finding all this stuff out now because Elon Musk is revealing the Twitter files. And so as far as him, so it's been good in this respect that Elon Musk is revealing this stuff. Now, the person who wrote this article that I'm going to quote from, his name is Justin Hart. He's an executive consultant with more than 25 years of experience with a Fortune 500 companies and presidential campaigns. He's also the chief data analyst and founder of RationalGround.com, which helps companies, public officials, and even parents gauge the impact of COVID-19 across the country. He's the co-author of Gone Viral, How COVID Drove the World Insane. Wow, I should get that guy on the show. Jay Bhattacharya is a professor. This is from his article that he wrote. So he's a professor at medicine at Stanford University, was a latecomer to Twitter, joining in the summer of 2021. In his first tweet, he linked to a recent article he had written that discussed age-based mortality risks and natural immunity, among other topics. His main message was powerful and contrary to COVID policies enacted across the country. Mass testing is an insidious form of lockdown by stealth, he wrote. Many Americans, especially parents of school-aged children, would agree. But it's possible that many on Twitter didn't see his message. This week, Twitter released a set of internal emails and documents from before Elon Musk's takeover of the company in October. One of the revelations was that Dr. Bhattacharya, among many others, had been censored and shadow banned, meaning his tweets were hidden in various ways by Twitter. Screenshots from it. So here, if you look at this, this was revealed, and it says that's your account. And inside Twitter, when they look at it inside Twitter, it showed up and it says Trends Blacklist. So that means don't ever let him trend. No matter what he says, and if it's popular, you suppress it. So they have an algorithm that stops your tweet from getting popular. And they did it to him. Okay. A doctor from Stanford, the Twitter's doing this. How many people endured weeks-long quarantine because Dr. Bhattacharya's message was suppressed? How many students would have been spared the education death knell of remote learning had schools heeded his advice or even known about his advice? Unlike Dr. Bhattacharya, I'm not a medical expert. Normally, I wouldn't insert myself into someone else's domain, but the nation's health authorities had no problem inserting themselves into mine. They meddled in my business, my church, my kids' education, my health, my grocery store, my gym, my coffee shop, my barber. In each case, some government entity was there with strangling regulations or in order to shut down entirely. So I formed a ragtag group of activists, analysts, experts, and parents, all trying to get our lives back to normal. We called our group Rational Ground and worked to amplify common sense COVID policies. We published interactive charts, highlighted data, refuting the stay-at-home orders, and pointed out the low risk of the virus for children. It was a lonely and difficult fight, but Dr. Bhattacharya was a calm and steady ally. By the fall of 2020, we focused our efforts to support Dr. to support Scott Atlas, a Stanford colleague of Dr. Bhattacharya and a key advisor to the Trump administration on COVID. The Biden administration pushed for restrictions and for censorship of those who disagreed with the government's official position. In July 2021, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki announced, "We've increased disinformation research and tracking within the Surgeon General's office. We're flagging problematic posts for Facebook that spread disinformation." Just the idea that the White House press secretary, aka the best paid professional liar in Washington, because that's what that job is. You're a professional liar. She's gonna alert when other people are lying. We've got to do some hard work and get rid of disinformation. The biggest liar is always the government. Then the second is the corporate-owned media, and then maybe randos on Twitter. But the government, that's the irony here. It's like Chris Christie's wagging your finger at you for staying too long at the buffet. Okay. Ms. Psaki also revealed that senior staff for President Biden were a part of the White House efforts to suppress free speech. This week's revelations about Twitter add to the evidence that something bad was afoot. Dr. Bhattacharya expressed shock on learning his account had been targeted for censorship. The thought that will keep me up tonight: censorship of scientific discussion permitted policies like school closures, and a generation of children were hurt, he tweeted. Remembering the adage that sunlight is the best disinfectant, Elon Musk, whose takeover of Twitter led to a series of other revelations, replied to Dr. Bhattacharya, "The sun is coming." Well, let's bring in Dr. Bhattacharya to get his take on all of this. You were shocked to find out you were shadow banned, or had you suspected it?
I mean, I suspected it. I think everyone who's been on the other side of the COVID debate, not the non-lockdown side, has suspected that our messages weren't getting to people. But it really did surprise me. I mean, I didn't think Twitter. I mean, I never got flagged for misinformation directly. I would tweet, and I got a lot of followers immediately. But it turns out what they did is this trends blacklist. It made it so that my tweets would go to my followers, but it never went to other people. The whole purpose of going on Twitter for me was, I mean, I generally write peer-reviewed papers for a living. I don't know how to reach large audience. I figured I'd go on Twitter. I'd tell people that hadn't heard my message about it. What the Trends Blacklist did, it made sure that only people that followed me heard my message, not very many other people. And how was I supposed to know directly? No one ever told me. It's funny, like the word blacklist is also a funny thing. It's like it's as if I'm some sort of like 1950s communist. The whole thing is just surreal. I mean, in the United States of America, to have that happen is shocking. I mean, I think, but I mean, I guess it's not all that shocking given what we've seen in the last 3 years. I just, I actually got invited by Elon Musk to come visit Twitter headquarters. And They showed me that internal tool, yeah. You could look and see in the history of it. I was literally put on that blacklist the day I joined Twitter.
Is that because you had already signed on to the Great Barrington Declaration?
I think so, yeah. I think it's the Great Barrington Declaration that led Twitter, put me on the black. And Jimmy, I don't think that it was done on Twitter by itself. I think what happened is there were, and you read that piece talked about Jen Psaki. I mean, we know that there were a dozen government agencies that were working to suppress what they call misinformation, and they were sending Twitter names of people to suppress, keywords to suppress, to make sure that the message about lockdowns all was univocal. You know, we have to have school closures. We have to do this. We have to do that. And that anyone pushing back got the other, got the bum's rap. I think it's funny. I actually think this intensified under President Biden, but it was ongoing under President Trump as well. I mean, just because it was the federal agencies that were doing this, the health agencies that were sending like trying to suppress the debate, channel the debate so that people didn't question the lockdowns. And
so, would you attribute nefarious motives to that, or because I do? Why do you think that they wanted to not have a debate like you would normally have in science and medicine? Why did they not want that?
Yeah, well, when we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, and you alluded to this, Jimmy, 4 days after we wrote it, the head of the National Institute of Health, this in October 2020, Francis Collins, head of the National Institute of Health, wrote an email to Tony Fauci calling me a fringe epidemiologist.
Yes.
I mean, actually, now I have a business card that says, fringe epidemiology on it. I mean, this is all the fun people are on the fringe nowadays. I don't know if you know. And he wrote it to Tony Fauci saying, and there's calling for a devastating takedown of the premises of the Great Barrington Declaration. The NIH was on high alert. Why? Because you had professors at Stanford, Harvard, Oxford writing to say Tony Fauci was wrong, that the lockdown policy was a mistake, that there were alternate ways to protect vulnerable people. They couldn't stand a debate because if they had the debate, they would have lost it. Tens of thousands of people, were doctors and epidemiologists and scientists signed on because what we were proposing was the old pandemic plan. It's the least original thing I spent my career trying to publish original research. The Great Barrington Declaration was the least original thing I ever wrote in my entire life. It was just the old plan. And the reason why they were trying to suppress it is because it was the old plan. There was nothing, there was just 100 years of wisdom in it. And all I did is just write saying, here's 100 years of wisdom.
When you say it's the old plan, what do you, can you explain more on that? What do you mean the old plan?
Sure. I mean, if you go back in the last century of infectious infectious disease pandemics, like the respiratory virus pandemics, just go back to 2009. We didn't lock down. We didn't close schools really. If you go back to 2003, the SARS epidemic, there was no lockdown. If you go back further in history, 1976, there was no lockdown. 1968, there was no lockdown. 1957, there was no lockdown. Respiratory virus pandemic after respiratory virus pandemic, what we did was we followed a strategy of focused protection. We worked to protect people who were vulnerable. In those pandemics, it was older people who were vulnerable. So we worked to try to protect them, develop therapeutics as rapidly as we could, vaccines as rapidly as we could, and deploy them with priority for the older people. It was the old plan that managed a century of respiratory virus pandemics, and it worked for a century.
So that's what you mean by the old plan, the plan that you had instituted many times over, and was a scientific consensus, basically, of how to handle pandemics of respiratory viruses. And for some reason, when it came to this virus, which looks like they manufactured in a U.S. biolab, for some reason they changed it all when it came to this. Why do you think they wanted to change the old plan to this new plan?
So I mean, I think I'm bad at like deep reasons, but let me tell you at least some of the intermediate reasons. So what's different between 2009 and now? One is we didn't have Zoom. Zoom allowed a certain class of people, the laptop class, to protect themselves against the harms of the lockdown. They didn't lose their jobs. They didn't lose their opportunities. They could replace their kids' loss of learning with tutors who would come in. Many of them were unemployed teachers that would come in and do tutoring. So you had a class of people who didn't suffer so much during the lockdown. I remember in 2020, 401ks went through the roof. The stock market went through the roof. They didn't even suffer financially. So you had a class of people that could protect themselves from the depredations of the lockdown. You couldn't have that in 2009 because you didn't have this technology. Zoom, in some sense, caused the lockdown.
Is that a Microsoft product, by the way, Zoom?
No.
Oh, okay, because that would be too convenient.
I only use Microsoft products myself.
Okay.
Well, I think Microsoft had Skype. There was Skype in 2009, but it wasn't fit for purpose. It didn't work nearly as well. So I think the other thing is we have this technology, this mRNA technology, that didn't exist. The idea that we could I have to tell you, I did several things I got wrong during the pandemic. One of the things in March of 2020, if you'd asked me how long would it take to develop a vaccine, I would have said it would take years to develop an effective vaccine against this. I was really surprised by the speed. Now, that's actually a good thing in one sense. The fact that so many scientists came together and used these creative ideas, I think that was I think if we'd used it right to protect vulnerable older people and not force the rest of the population to take it, that would have been fine. In fact, not just fine, actively good. So that the idea that there were these scientists that knew that we might be able to develop a vaccine in 9 months. Now, if we didn't have that in like 1957 or 1968 or whatever, you don't. If you're going to lock down, you have to have an endpoint. And if the promise is, okay, we're going to have a vaccine in 9 months, and that's the endpoint, we can stop then. That leads you to lock down when you otherwise wouldn't have, right? If you think that the vaccine is going to take 10 years to develop, you're never going to lock down. Like no one's going to want 10 years of lockdown, hoping to live in a bunker, hoping to like get free someday. And so the vaccine technology development in March of 2020, the fact that it developed to the point where so many people were very hopeful that it could develop quickly enough so we only have to lock down for a short period of time. The fact that we had Zoom, those technologies, I think, permitted the lockdown to become a thinkable thought in March of 2020. And then
go ahead.
Oh, no, the other thing is the Chinese example, right? So China. So China. I mean, this you can see in emails, Jimmy. It's in. You can look in like emails with the NIH. You got this guy named Cliff Lane, who was he was basically an aide to Tony Fauci. The NIH organized to make sure he went on this like junket to China in February 2020 to see what China did right. Because and he comes back from China and sends an email around saying, "Look, what the China did worked. A month-long lockdown, albeit at great cost." He wrote, and he said, "We have a very difficult decision to make. It should involve more than just the people in this room." Meaning, he meant like a couple of people, the World Health Organization, the NIH. That Chinese example played an enormous role in the thinking that government bureaucrats like Tony Fauci had, and in the advice that they gave, like Debbie Birx gave to the President of the United States. So you had this like confluence of things. Like there's like the Chinese example, there's the availability of technology, and I think you know this is something that you think as a health economist and as an economist I would know for sure, but like. There were also a lot of private actors that thought that they would benefit, right? Like Pfizer for sure. Now it's mixed, right? So you have people like people who work at Pfizer. They think they're saving their lives, right? They think they're like developing. I mean, you know, they kind of are, but at the same time, you have a profit motive. It's like this mixed thing. So like a lot of people made tremendous mistakes. All of that is understandable. What I don't understand is why did they stop the debate from happening? They could have, suppose they just opened the debate up, I think they would have lost. The schools would have opened especially in fall of 2020. They would have lost that debate. They just didn't allow it to happen. That's the shock. Like the world is always filled with these like conflicting motives, and I mean that's just normal. I think. The weird, abnormal thing was they stopped the debate from happening. They didn't let me or my colleagues who knew we were making tremendous mistakes have a say. They put me on a blacklist. And I think people saw, I mean, as a result, the normal like immune system that happens in science, which is other scientists saying, no, wait, you're wrong. That didn't happen. That wasn't allowed to happen. And what happened as a result, it was like working class people suffered. It's poor people that suffered. It's children that suffered.
Right. But there's still a big, faction of what we call the COVIDians or the lockdown left. We call them here. That want more. They want more lockdowns. They want more mandates. They still, which is to me the just craziest thing that people are still talking about. That we did an article, we did a story the other day about how the editor for Scientific America is finally got COVID, and she chronicled her 3-year journey of wearing N95 masks and never going out and all kinds of stuff like that. And she said, just because I got it doesn't mean getting COVID is inevitable. That's exactly what it means. That's exactly what it means. It's like saying I'm not going to get a cold for the rest of my life. Isn't that the exact same thing?
You're exactly right, Jimmy. That's exactly what they're thinking. They're thinking that somehow they're so special, so different, so elevated and above that they can avoid getting a disease that spreads as rapidly as a cold, as easily as a cold. They can hide themselves away forever from humanity. But that's not possible for most of us, for the rest of us. Funny thing is, like, I'm in touch with a number of folks in the UK who are on the left, like Sunetra Gupta, who wrote the Great Barrington Declaration with me. She's very famously a Labour, like she votes for Labour. She's very much on the left. A very large number of people on the left outside the US have seen the light and said, look, this was a mistake we made. The Swedish, it was the Swedish left that opposed the lockdowns. The politics of this in the U.S. is so crazy. I just don't understand it.
The left was pushing the lockdowns in the United States, and the right was fighting them. And you were considered a bad person if you had a question about any of it. It's the first time in my life I've ever seen this happen. That I've seen comedians now go and say things like, please tell me you're not going to do your own research. Before COVID, doing your own research used to be called reading. So that's how bad it's gotten. That's how much people have internalized the big pharma propaganda that they're shaming people for reading about an experimental medical treatment they're being forced to take under loss of job or can't travel. Or it's just I've never seen something so nuts in my life that you're not allowed to question that. And if you do, you're a bad person. And so tell me about what it's like at Stanford, right? So there's a lot of people at Stanford that don't like to question, apparently, right?
Yeah. So like you mentioned Scott Atlas earlier. Scott Atlas is a colleague of mine at Stanford. I didn't know him well before the pandemic, but we've gotten to be real good friends since. He got called by President Trump in July, I think, of 2020, several months after the lockdown had started. I think Trump, he was having second thoughts about the lockdowns that he himself had instituted. And so he brings in Scott Atlas. Scott is an honest scientist. He's just an honest guy, right? So he and I are sharing papers, like political papers, like literally scientific papers for months up to July. And for scientists, it's kind of an exciting time. Like, how often do you get to see a new disease, right? I'm learning about it in real time. It's really quite exciting. I'm talking to Scott about, here's what we've learned. And so he gets called by President Trump to be an advisor. Tony Fauci and Debbie Birx basically view him as like the enemy. He's sharing papers with them, papers that he and I have discussed. He's showing them to them, and they won't look at his papers. These are scientific papers, they're not his papers. These are papers by other scientists in peer-reviewed journals. They're not interested in the science at all. President Trump, I think his instincts were to listen to Scott, but like his political people were telling him if he fires Fauci or Birx, he's going to lose the re-election. And of course he lost anyways. So you have this like there's this perfect storm where no one's listening to the scientific data. Scott's trying to tell people, here's the scientific data. And there's this huge like pushback to him in the press. Like he's getting absolutely destroyed by the Washington Post and New York Times. And on campus, 100 people signed this letter. Friends and colleagues of mine signed this letter accusing Scott of essentially being a pseudoscientist, accusing him of not even really being in favor of hand washing, which was ridiculous. I mean, he was an honest scientist. He used to be the head of neuroradiology at Stanford. They knew him, and yet they attacked him. But the person who organized the letter against Scott was a personal friend of Tony Fauci on campus, and it just divided the campus. I haven't seen some of my colleagues, many of whom I published papers with for 3 years. It's just it's like the atmosphere on campus is terrible. Like normally you'd think a place like Stanford would be a place where people could disagree with each other about science. That's what we do, right? For a living is to like talk to each other and learn from each other about when we don't know something, we go talk to our colleagues and they teach us. That's not what Stanford's been like the last 3 years, at least for me. It's been just a hostile work environment.
Doesn't that? So, because of the way I was raised by abusive alcoholics, my reflex to that information is to get angry. Right? It makes me angry. It makes me want to seek a way to have a confrontation with these people. Now, what does it anger you at all that science is being so disrespected because of politics? And by the way, I'll tell you. All right, I'll tell you later. Go ahead.
I mean, for me, like at least as far as my colleague, just makes me sad, Jimmy. I mean, I'm trying to be forgiving. I mean, I want to be forgiving because I want to learn from these folks again. There were a lot of very bright people, but they were just wrong about the lockdowns, about school closures, a whole host of things. And they can't bring themselves to like reconcile with people like me just because I don't think it's a sin to be wrong if you're a scientist. It's just normal, actually, to be wrong. And so the sin is like not correcting yourself when there's data, and then like to support a blacklist. I guess I don't get angry that same way, Jim. I was raised by very loving parents. I think maybe that's I don't know. Well, I'm sure your parents loved you too, but the issue is like I just didn't. I don't get angry. I do get really. I mean, I don't know how to fix. I want to reconcile these relationships, especially with people I still care for, but I don't know how to do it. It's actually frustrating.
I don't know how to do it either. You know, I come from comedy, and we're supposed to be the biggest skeptics, and those people turn into the biggest propagandists and willing tools. And that would be one thing, but then turn on people like me who are staying the same. I'm always skeptical of big government, always skeptical of the FDA, and that we know they're captured. And I'm certainly skeptical of big pharma. And these people, you know, the same people who put asbestos in baby powder and then sold it to poor people, and the same people who sold the tainted blood clotting products with AIDS to people on purpose and knew. These are the same people who got half the country hooked on heroin on purpose. These are the same people who sold Vioxx that they knew would give you heart attacks, but they didn't care because these are the same people. When they all of a sudden, when they got together with the government during COVID, somehow they make beautiful babies. I don't understand this. So, but yeah, so what you're going through, I'm going through because you're supposed to come at it. Your colleagues are supposed to come at it from an academic perspective and be skeptical. And comedians are supposed to be cynics, and they're supposed to be skeptics of everything authoritarian, and they're not. And so you and I are now. If I feel some kind of camaraderie with you because I know how you feel.
Well, Jimmy, I've appreciated your commentary through the whole pandemic. It's just been like heartwarming to watch that there are folks out there that is, because I'm trying to. I'm not political. I really am not. I'm a scientist by nature and by heart. And the fact that I've had to like get involved in things that look political is actually kind of it pains me. And I don't know how to fix that. I don't know how to and the fact that you've had relationships broken because you've spoken up. I don't even blame the folks that on the other side of your debates. I blame my class of people, the scientists, who should have spoken up. Like, we poisoned the well instead of modeling normal behavior, instead of where we like tried to learn from each other, instead of like following what the data are actually saying. We scientists as a whole created this sense that if you don't follow lockdowns, you're a bad guy.
Yeah.
You don't support. I mean, and we moralized COVID so that we knew we shouldn't do it, but we did it. We said, okay, if you don't wear a mask, you're a bad guy. If you're unvaccinated, don't have a card, then you're a bad guy. If you've got COVID, the first question is, what did you do wrong? We made COVID into a sin, and we absolutely moralized it. Public health, my class of people moralized it, and it's the public that paid the price. All these broken relationships. I get emails from people telling me I haven't seen my my kids haven't seen their grandparents in years because my grandparents are scared to come out even after they got vaccinated. That breaks my heart because it's my class of people. It's the public health people I hold primarily responsible for this. We broke civilization with our paranoia, with our inability to follow the scientific method, our lack of ethics. And so I hear your story and I'm like, I don't even blame the other comedians, Jimmy. I know, and I'd ask, like, how do we be forgiving in that? I mean, you have to first start with like locally, I think. But I don't know how to. I think public health needs to get fixed. We need new leadership. Science needs to get fixed. It's fundamentally broken in a way I never thought would happen. So
it's the corporate capture of our regulatory agencies. It's the corporate capture of our media. So they got both of you. They got the government and they got the media. So, and $100 billion. People don't realize how much money that is. And I try to explain to them the music recording industry in the United States, all of it, everything that's been recorded only makes $12 billion a year. So now one company made what would take a decade for the entire recording music industry to make. They made it in 1 year. You know how much power that gives that company? That gives them enough power to buy everybody in the government and everybody in the media. And that's exactly what they did, which is why everybody thinks ivermectin, which is a miracle drug that saved billions of lives, was some kind of poison that was dangerous for you to take. That's why, because if that ivermectin did treat COVID, they couldn't get their emergency use authorization and they would have lost that $100 billion. And so my theory on all of this is that Dr. Collins, Dr. Fauci, he doesn't treat patients. That's another, people don't realize. Dr. Fauci, he doesn't treat anyone. He doesn't see any patient. He's an administrator. And he doesn't even do his own research. He doesn't do anything. Anyway, do you want to have the last word on this? And I have one more thing I'd like to talk to you about, just about in general, about all the things that Bill Gates has said. And I'd like to get your response to them. But if there's anything you'd like to say to wrap up this segment, go right ahead.
Yeah, just very, very fast. I mean, I do think that the financial entanglements play a big role in. I actually work with the FDA on vaccine safety, on drug safety, after it's been approved, and they've been incredibly slow in doing the basic work that would have identified safety signals if there are there. It's just been, and then they're normally slow, but they've been slow in ways that make it difficult to understand. Like they approved the booster, the BA.4/5 booster, for general use with an emergency use agreement, the emergency use authorization, on the basis of 8 mice, like data.
We covered it.
I just don't. I mean, it's just. I mean, your theory is that there's financial entanglements. It's hard to reject that when you have something so crazy like that. There's another theory, which is there are people at the FDA who legitimately think this is such a bad disease, you have to do this. I don't understand that, and I can't distinguish, because these are colleagues of mine that I've respected. They're making decisions that I don't understand at all. And I don't know how to reject your theory either, because you're right. The 45% of the FDA budget for a lot of this stuff is pharma funded,
up to 70% when they were deciding on the efficacy of new drugs. So it's corporate capture. And of course, I have to say, since we're on YouTube, that of course you and I both know that the vaccines are safe and effective, and they'll make sure that they work fantastically, and they'll make sure they keep you out of getting seriously ill or hospitalized or death, and the side effects are rare. So they're fantastic. Everybody should get them.
I think with vaccines, the key thing is always risk versus benefit.
Right.
And I think there are people who the risk benefit ratio is good for this vaccine, or at least was in 2021. And especially older people who have not had COVID before. All 3 people like that still left in the United States probably should get it.
Yeah, I mean, hasn't most kids have already had COVID, right? They've had Omicron.
Yeah, I think it's 90. There was a Harvard study, joint Harvard-Stanford study with some colleagues of mine. They estimated that 94% of people in the United States have already had COVID and recovered. 94%. What herd immunity looks like is you've had COVID before and recovered, or maybe you've had the vaccine or whatever. But now, if you get COVID, it's much less likely to produce severe disease and death because you have that immunity. That's what herd immunity is. It's like COVID circulates forever. We don't have any way to stop it. But when you get it, it's not going to kill you. That's what herd immunity is. Okay.
So herd immunity isn't that we get rid of COVID.
It's like trying to say we get rid of the other coronaviruses. They've been circulating for a very long time, and we don't have immunity to those things. Mean it doesn't kill you. You got the first coronavirus you got was when you were a baby, and it produced a little cold because when you're little, you're good at dealing with coronaviruses. But then because your body remembered how to deal with it, the second time you got a coronavirus, it was still a cold. And now every once in a while, every few years, you'll get an OC43 or whatever, and it'll produce a cold because your body remembers how to deal with it.
Okay. It was amazing to watch Dr. Sanjay Gupta on Joe Rogan's podcast not understand what natural immunity was, and he had to have it explained to him by a pothead comedian. It was amazing. Everybody, we're doing live stand-up comedy in Los Angeles in January and February in Los Angeles. And then we're going to Tempe, Palm Springs, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, Nashville. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for all those tickets and become a premium member while you're there.